The mason jar in my hands was heavier than it looked. I'd found it tucked behind a stack of rusted paint tins on the third shelf of my grandfather's barn, wrapped in an old strip of canvas that smelled of motor oil and pine resin. Inside were 47 gold coins, Royal Canadian mint maple leafs, 1 troy ounce each, stacked tight and gone slightly green around the rims from years sitting in the cold. Grandpa had shown me one when I was 10, pressing it flat against my palm. "Never trust what you can't hold in your own hand," he'd said. But 47 wasn't a collection. 47 was a signal. The canvas strip had writing on the inside. My grandfather's cramped, shaking capitals in blue ballpoint. "You found the first one. The rest won't come easy. Don't let your sister's husband know you're looking." I stood in that freezing November barn, with my breath fogging and my whole body trembling, and it had nothing to do with the cold. I need to back up. The will was read 3 weeks earlier in a Kentville law office that smelled like old carpet and printer toner. My grandfather, Harold, had lived his entire 81 years on the same 83 acres in the Annapolis Valley of Nova Scotia, apple orchard and open field that had been in our family since his own father farmed it after coming home from the Second World War. Grandpa Harold had gone to Korea himself, come back with a shrapnel scar on his left forearm and a deep suspicion of anyone who talked about money without doing actual work, and spent the next 5 decades building a life that looked modest from the outside and was, in fact, something else entirely. He wore the same 3 Stanfield's flannel shirts on rotation. He drove a 2001 GMC Sierra with 340,000 kilometers on it and a crack in the windshield he'd patched with electrical tape. He ate oatmeal every morning and kept a tin of Scotch mints in his breast pocket. But he'd quietly expanded the apple operation into a regional supply contract, sold off 40 acres at the right moment in the 90s, and had a mind for numbers that he never once advertised. Especially not to my father, and especially not to my brother-in-law, Dale. Dale was the reason my sister Brooke had moved back to Nova Scotia after university. He ran a property development company out of Dartmouth. Residential builds, some commercial, always in the right neighborhoods at the right moment. He had the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been wrong about anything expensive enough to matter. He wore performance fleece vests with logos on them. He had opinions about Bank of Canada rate projections at Christmas dinner. In the last 3 years before my grandfather passed, he had made a point of visiting the farm every few weeks, sitting across the kitchen table from Grandpa Harold and talking at him about what the land was really worth and what options the old man might want to consider. My grandfather listened to every word, with his hands around a mug of tea, and said almost nothing. I was not Dale. I was the other one, the quieter, significantly less impressive one. I'd done an electrical apprenticeship after 2 years of university, convinced me I didn't know what I wanted to study, and I'd spent the last 6 years working for a commercial contractor out of Halifax. I was 31 years old. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the North End with a roommate and a recurring dispute with my landlord about the water heater. I was not going broke, but I was not getting ahead either. I had $14,000 in savings, $22,000 left on my truck loan, and a credit card I was managing very carefully. My grandfather was the only person in my family who treated that life like it was worth something. He came to visit me in Halifax twice a year, always without Brooke or my parents, and we'd go down to the waterfront and get fish and chips from a takeout counter he'd been going to since before I was born. He asked about my work. He listened to the answers. Once, watching me eat, he said, "A man who understands how things are actually built is never truly helpless. Remember that." I didn't know, at the time, that he was telling me something specific. He passed in September, cardiac, quick, in his own kitchen. The funeral was at the United Church in Kentville. Every farmer and shop owner in the valley came. I cried at the graveside. My brother-in-law checked his phone. The will was read 2 weeks later. My parents sat rigidly on a vinyl bench. Brooke sat beside Dale, who had his arms crossed and his jaw set the way it gets when he's certain he's about to receive something he has already spent. The estate lawyer read through the preliminary bequests, the Sierra to a nephew in Truro, his tools to the Legion, his Korean War medals to the Nova Scotia Museum of Natural History. Then the property, the farmhouse and the primary 80 acres, including all outbuildings, equipment, and proceeds from the current season's apple contracts, were left jointly to my parents, worth, at current Annapolis Valley values, approximately $1.8 million. My sister didn't blink. She and Dale had clearly already had this conversation. And to his younger grandson, that was me, my grandfather left the eastern parcel. The eastern parcel was 3.5 acres at the far edge of the farm, separated from the main property by a woodlot and a dried-up creek bed. There was one structure on it, a detached timber frame barn built in the 1940s, not actively maintained in at least 20 years, with no road access from the main farm. You reached it from a gravel fire road off a municipal cider road 2 kilometers east. No power, no water connection. The provincial land registry appraised the parcel at $28,000. My brother-in-law let out a short sound that he quickly converted into a cough. We all heard it. The lawyer also informed me that my grandfather had included $4,000 cash to cover immediate property taxes and any necessary assessment fees. She slid the envelope across the table without meeting my eyes. Brooke patted my hand. "He always did love that old barn," she said, in the tone you use when you're explaining something embarrassing about a person who can no longer speak for themselves. Dale leaned in before he stood to leave, quiet enough that only I could hear. "You know I'd take that parcel off your hands. Give you a fair number. No point in paying taxes on a liability." He said it gently, helpfully, which was somehow worse than if he'd gloated. I drove back to Halifax that night and didn't sleep. It took me 3 weeks to work up the nerve to go. My practical situation was this. I had a few $100s left of the $4,000 after the first quarterly tax installment. My landlord had given me notice that he was selling the building, which meant I needed first and last month's rent for a new place within 60 days. My truck payment was coming out in 11 days. And I owned 3.5 acres of Nova Scotia land that I couldn't build on, couldn't farm, and couldn't sell for enough to cover 2 months of expenses. My plan, such as it was, drive out, assess the structural damage, take photos, call a rural property broker, maybe get $25,000, maybe $30,000 if the timber frame had salvage value, enough to stop the bleeding. The gravel fire road was overgrown enough that I had to stop twice to move fallen birch branches with my bare hands. When the barn came into view through the alders, my heart sank in exactly the way I expected. It was a large building, maybe 15 meters by 8, with a gambrel roof that had partially collapsed on the west end, letting daylight through in long diagonal shafts. The board and batten siding had gone the silver gray of old driftwood. The main sliding door had come off its bottom track. Decades of leaf litter had built up against the foundation until some of the lower boards had rotted completely through. But the timber frame itself, the bones of the thing, was old-growth Douglas fir. Thick, the kind of structural member you can't buy anymore. I could see it through the gaps in the siding, and it was solid. I spent 2 days doing what I could, cleared debris, braced the sliding door back onto its track, checked the foundation sill, swept out swallow nests and the evidence of generations of field mice. I slept in my truck the first night, then drove to the farmhouse. My parents had given me a key and slept in the spare room on a camping mat. On the morning of the 3rd day, I found the mason jar. I'd been moving shelving units away from the back wall to check the siding condition behind them, and there it was, tucked between a rusted tin of Varsol and a folded canvas tarp, sealed with a wire bale lid, wrapped in that strip of canvas. The 47 coins, the weight of them, and the note. "You found the first one. The rest won't come easy. Don't let your sister's husband know you're looking." I sat down on an overturned milk crate and read it 6 times. My grandfather had known I'd come here. He'd known I'd do the work. And he'd specifically, by name of relationship, warned me about Dale. I put the jar carefully back, exactly where I'd found it. Then I started looking for a journal. I found it on the fourth day, wrapped in wax paper inside a metal ammunition box, bolted to the underside of a hayloft beam. The kind of thing you'd need to know was there to find. Inside was a composition notebook, the old marbled kind. My grandfather's handwriting covered it date by date, going back 11 years. The early entries were what you'd expect. Apple harvest notes, weather observations, thoughts about drainage. But about 4 years in, the handwriting got smaller and more careful, as if he'd become conscious of who might eventually read it. March 14. Dale visited again, asked about the Fire Road parcel in case I ever want to move the barn structure. He doesn't want the structure. He wants the ground. He's had someone survey the property line. He's looking for something specific. June 7. I know what he's found. There was a ground-penetrating radar crew on the adjacent property last fall. I asked around, prospecting for aggregate deposits. Apparently there's a band of construction-grade sand and gravel under this whole ridge worth significant money for residential fill. Dale thinks the eastern parcel sits on top of the richest concentration of it. I turned the page slowly. August 22. I had a geologist out from Dalhousie through the Farmers Federation. Confirmed. The eastern parcel has aggregate extraction rights worth conservatively $8 to $12 million. Dale doesn't know I know. Your father doesn't know either. I've decided not to tell them. I've decided to do something else entirely. I sat on the loft ladder for a long time, just holding the notebook. My grandfather had known the land was valuable, not because of the barn, because of what was geologically beneath it. And he had said nothing. He had watched Dale sit across his kitchen table and talk about land values and options, and done nothing but drink his tea. I kept reading. November 3. The liquidations are complete. I've used a notary in Wolfville and a financial advisor in Halifax. Separately, neither knowing the other's involvement. What I've moved is mine, free and clear, bought over 30 years with money that came from my own labor and my own decision. Paper wealth is a promise someone else can break. What I've built is in the floor of the barn, beneath the threshing bay. Look for the stone footing that doesn't match the others. The weight of the earth is yours. Protect it. Don't give it away cheaply. Don't give it away at all. The threshing bay was the center section of the barn, with a floor of packed earth under old planking. There were 6 stone footings supporting the loft beams. 5 were rough-cut local granite, all the same pale gray. The 6th, at the southeast corner, was darker, cut more precisely. Different hands, different era. I got down on my hands and knees with a flashlight. The planking around that corner had been replaced at some point. Newer nails, less weathered wood. I used my pry bar. The boards came up without much resistance. Underneath was a poured concrete slab with an embedded steel ring. I used my angle grinder on the padlock. 8 minutes and most of a grinding disc. When the shackle snapped, the sound bounced off the old timber frame like a gunshot. The hatch was heavy, poured concrete reinforced with rebar, close to 200 pounds. I got the pry bar under one edge, lifted with everything I had, and rolled it sideways onto the earthen floor with a crash that shook the building. The cellar beneath was concrete-walled, maybe 2 meters square, with a wooden ladder down one side. The air that came up was cold and dry, sealed for years. I took the ladder down. 4 military surplus containers sat in a row on the floor, green-painted steel, latched but not locked. The first one held Royal Canadian Mint gold maple leaf coins nested in foam, 1 troy ounce each, stacked in careful columns. The second held more coins alongside a series of professional archival sleeves, and inside the sleeves were stamps, old ones, the kind you recognize without knowing why, as something that doesn't belong in a barn on a dirt floor. The third held a thick craft envelope with financial records I couldn't fully parse at a glance. Liquidation receipts, account closure confirmations, private placement records going back a decade and a half. The fourth container had an envelope resting on top, with my name written on it in my grandfather's hand. I tore it open. If you've made it this far without telling anyone, you're doing better than I expected, and I had high expectations. What you're looking at is approximately 30 years of careful decisions. The gold coins, 847 in total, counting the ones on the shelf, are maple leafs, pure, traceable only to the mint and to my personal purchase records. The stamp collection is a separate matter. I spent 22 years building it. There are 4 sheets in those sleeves that a philatelist from the Royal Philatelic Society of Canada assessed, conservatively, at between $2 and $4 million on the specialist market. The rest of the collection is not far behind. Total value of what's in those 4 containers, at the time I'm writing this, is somewhere between $28 and $35 million CAD. Every dollar of it purchased with post-tax income from my own accounts over my own lifetime. None of it belongs to your father's estate. None of it belongs to Dale. Your sister received the farmhouse and the orchard. She'll do fine. She and Dale will eventually sell and do very well. I don't begrudge her that. But I need you to understand something. Dale has known about the aggregate deposits under your parcel for 2 years. He has been waiting for me to die so he can approach you before you learn what that land is actually worth. The extraction rights alone are worth 8 to 12 million. Don't sell. Don't let him near it. I left you what I could. Use a proper lawyer, not the cheapest one. The kind that charges by the hour and makes you feel it. You can afford it now. Go build something. Grandpa Harold. I read the letter 3 times, sitting in the dirt of that cellar with my back against the cold concrete. Then I sat in the dark for a while without reading anything at all. The barn door slid open above me. I killed my flashlight. I pressed myself against the wall. 2 sets of footsteps crossed the planking overhead, one heavier than the other. He's been here. My brother-in-law's voice, flat and businesslike. Look at the shelving unit. He moved it. Trucks still on the fire road. A voice I didn't recognize, older, deliberate. Footsteps moved toward the open hatch, a shaft of gray light from above. Then Dale's voice, almost to himself, "Harold, you brilliant old man." A pause, then louder, "I know you're down there. Come up, we need to talk." I didn't move. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "If there's an asset question, the right approach is to handle it as a family. Come up and we'll talk this through." Family. He used the word the way someone uses a word they've rehearsed. "How did you know I was here?" I called up. "Motion sensor on the fire road gate. Been there since spring. I knew you'd come eventually, just not when." "Since spring, before my grandfather was even gone." "My associate and I have driven a long way," Dale said, and his voice had tightened a degree. "Whatever you've found down there, Harold's estate is still in probate. Nothing removed from this property is legally yours until the process is complete." He said it calmly, reasonably, like he was explaining load-bearing requirements to a homeowner who didn't understand construction. He was wrong. The deed had been transferred free and clear at the will reading. The lawyer had confirmed it explicitly. But Dale was betting I didn't know that, or that I was frightened enough not to test it. I climbed the ladder. My brother-in-law was standing 5 meters away in the filtered light of the barn, wearing a performance fleece vest and hiking boots that had never seen a trail. Behind him, a heavy-set man in a Carhartt jacket stood with his arms at his sides and the particular stillness of someone paid to be still. Dale looked at me, then past me, at the open hatch at the darkness below. Something shifted in his face, a recalibration. "What's in the containers?" he said. Not a question. "My inheritance," I said. He shook his head slowly. "Harold used family resources over a lifetime to acquire whatever's down there. The estate is still." "He used his own post-tax income over 30 years," I said. "I have the notarized purchase records and the account closure documents. They're in that cellar right now." Dale looked at his associate, then back at me. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter and more careful, the voice he used when he wanted someone to feel like they'd already lost something before the conversation finished. "You're an electrician," he said. The probate process is more complicated than you're aware of. I have lawyers who have been watching this estate file since September. If I file a contested claim, I can tie up access to this property for 3 to 5 years. By the time it's resolved, the legal costs will consume whatever's in those boxes. He said it without malice, as if it were simply a fact about the world that I should be grateful to know. Then I need to make a call, I said. Excuse me. I walked past him to the barn door. My legs were completely steady, which surprised me. He didn't move to stop me. Outside, November air hit my face like cold water, 1 bar of cell service at the edge of the gravel turnaround. I called the litigation firm in Halifax that my grandfather had named specifically in a note tucked inside the composition notebook, a firm he'd consulted 3 years earlier, quietly, exactly about this scenario. The duty lawyer answered. I gave her my name. I told her I was calling at my grandfather's instruction regarding a sealed asset transfer. I told her I believed the property was currently being trespassed upon by a party with a declared financial interest. She asked me to hold. When she came back 90 seconds later, she had specific questions, the kind that told me she already knew some of what I was describing. My grandfather had not only consulted this firm 3 years ago. He had left a file with them, a full file, copies of every liquidation record, every notarized purchase receipt, a sworn declaration about the nature and provenance of the assets. He'd paid a retainer in 2021 and instructed them to wait for my call. We can have a senior partner on site tomorrow morning, she said. In the meantime, document everything. Don't allow anything to be removed, and if anyone on the property has made a verbal claim or implied a legal threat, write down the exact words and the time they were said. I went back into the barn. My brother-in-law and his associate were standing at the edge of the open hatch, my brother-in-law's phone flashlight shining down into the cellar. He was looking at the containers. His face in that moment was the face of a man doing arithmetic. I've spoken to my grandfather's retained firm, I said. They have his full documentation on file. They're sending someone tomorrow morning. Dale turned. The expression on his face was one I hadn't seen before. Careful recalculation, the same look he got at Christmas dinner when an interest rate projection went the wrong way. You're making this complicated, he said. You trespassed on a titled property and made a legal threat, I said. I think you made it complicated. He didn't say anything else. He and his associate left. I watched his truck disappear down the fire road through the alder scrub, and then I went back inside and sat on the milk crate in the threshing bay until it was fully dark. The weeks that followed were the most expensive and the most clarifying of my life. The litigation firm sent a senior partner the next morning. She walked through every document in the cellar with the methodical patience of someone who charges by the hour and finds that rate entirely justified. The assets were mine, clean, legally acquired, fully documented. The Nova Scotia probate court took 4 months to formally confirm it. My brother-in-law attempted to file an intervenor claim, arguing the coins constituted undisclosed estate property. The claim was dismissed within 6 weeks. The notarized purchase records were that thorough. The stamp collection was assessed by a specialist from the Royal Philatelic Society of Canada who flew in from Toronto. The 4 key sheets came back at $4.1 million, the remainder of the collection at $2.6 million. The gold coins, 847 total, including the mason jar, were valued at just over $2.2 million CAD at spot, and the extraction rights on the eastern parcel, assessed by a geological engineering firm out of Fredericton, came back at $10.4 million. I did not sell the parcel to Dale. I licensed the extraction rights to a provincial aggregate company through a competitive bid process and used the royalty income to establish a trust. When the probate was finalized and the figures were confirmed, I sat in the Halifax offices of the litigation firm and looked at a balance sheet that felt like it belonged to someone else. Total value, across all assets, somewhere just north of $30 million. All of it legally mine. All of it earned by a man in a flannel shirt who drove a cracked windshield Sierra and kept Scotch mints in his pocket. I didn't buy a new truck. I didn't move into a waterfront condo. I took a leave from the contractor and spent 3 months trying to figure out what I actually wanted to do. What I kept coming back to, every time, was the barn, the Douglas fir frame, the gambrel roofline, the bones of a thing my great-grandfather had built and my grandfather had refused to tear down. I hired a structural engineer and a restoration contractor I'd worked beside on a heritage project in Dartmouth. We spent 8 months taking the barn apart carefully and putting it back together correctly. New roofing, restored siding, a rebuilt threshing bay with a proper electrical panel that I ran myself. The loft became a small studio apartment, which I rent below market rate to a doctoral student in environmental science at Acadia University. My grandfather would have approved of that. The intervenor claim had consequences for my brother-in-law beyond the legal dismissal. The failed claim became part of a broader Nova Scotia Securities Commission review of his company's financing practices, reviews I did not initiate and had nothing to do with initiating, but did not discourage. His development company restructured significantly. He and my sister eventually sold the farmhouse and moved to Calgary. I didn't contest any of it. I didn't need to. My father came to see me the following spring. He stood in the restored barn with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked up at the rebuilt timber frame, the old-growth fir, the new steel connectors, the loft with its south-facing windows. "I didn't know," he said, "about any of it. Your grandfather, he never said a word." "I know," I said. "He wasn't punishing anyone." My father nodded. He looked at the repaired gambrel roof for a long time. "He always knew you'd come out here and actually do the work." We stood together in that barn without talking for a while after that. It was the closest to understanding each other that we have ever been. The hatch in the threshing bay floor is still there, integrated into the new oak planking, flush and almost invisible unless you know where to look. Below it, the old cellar has been converted into a proper climate-controlled vault. The gold coins are still in it, in the same containers, exactly where my grandfather put them. I think about him most mornings, standing at the loft window with a coffee, watching the apple trees at the edge of the woodlot, the ones he planted in 1987 that have been growing untended for years and have gotten gnarled and strange and completely their own. They still produce fruit, not the reliable commercial kind, the kind that grows the way it wants. He never trusted what he couldn't hold in his own hands. He spent 30 years quietly moving wealth into a form that no one could argue about, no corporate lawyer could attach a lien to, and no amount of expensive promises could dissolve. He left the things that looked valuable to the people who only understood value in those terms, and he left everything that actually mattered to the one person who came out to the barn just to sit with him, not to assess it, not to calculate it, just to be there. That's what he left me. All the rest was just where it was stored.